Hello there. To begin this episode, I want you to take a trip back in time with me. There's a laboratory, there are scientists, and there are rats. I want you to imagine that there's a rat in a cage. And there's a lever in the cage. Every time this rat pushes the lever, a pellet of food is released. Obviously, after doing this for a time, the scientists become curious. What happens if, when the rat pushes the lever, no pellet comes out? Eventually, the rat loses interest, goes on to preoccupy itself with other things. What do these two experiments have in common? There's consistency in terms of the pattern that the rat perceives. Either they push the lever and a pellet comes out, which is consistency, or they push the lever and a pellet doesn't come out, which is also consistency. This consistency is referred to as continuous reinforcement. So naturally, these scientists became interested. What happens if we create inconsistency in the experiment? What happens if, when the rat pushes the lever, occasionally and randomly and unpredictably, a pellet comes out? They assumed that eventually the rat would become so frustrated that it would lose interest with the lever. In fact, the exact opposite occurred. The rat became absolutely anxiously obsessed with the lever. It kept pressing on it and pressing on it. It had created an addiction, in fact, to the lever. Surprise. So what happens if, after introducing the intermittent reinforcement of that pellet coming out when the rat pushes the lever only occasionally, if the pellet stopped completely? Surely the rat would lose interest then. No, the opposite occurred. If the rat received random pellets, once the pellet stopped completely, the rat remained completely obsessively controlling over that lever. It basically became so incredibly addicted to it that regardless of whether it was getting nothing at all, it neglected its grooming habits, and its health deteriorated completely. Wow. This told us something about reward and behavior. This rat was engaged in an intermittent reinforcement experiment. Now, intermittent reinforcement refers to much more than just this scenario, where a reward is randomly, unpredictably, and inconsistently given. For the sake of this episode, we're going to assume that intermittent reinforcement applies to things you want that are only granted inconsistently, unpredictably, and occasionally. But conversely, intermittent reinforcement also applies to things like rules and personal boundaries that are only enforced inconsistently, unpredictably, and occasionally. This causes people to become confused and either become terrified about how to interact with the person setting the rule or boundary, or to conversely push the limits until they get what they want from the person who is enforcing that rule or boundary. Intermittent reinforcement creates addiction. Just think about gambling. The addiction to gambling rests on the laurels of intermittent reinforcement. When you sit down at a slot machine, you absolutely cannot predict the pattern in which the reward is going to come. You may think you can, you may be desperately trying to figure out that pattern so that you can achieve the reward, whatever it is that you want or need, and yet you can't. The desperation that you feel and the starvation of not getting that reward is completely relieved in the moment that you do get that reward. In other words, you get the jackpot, or you even get a random and minor reward out of that slot machine. Oh gosh, it's completely elating. It's amazing to feel that feeling. This addiction is based on intermittent reinforcement. The intermittent reinforcement creates obsession. You become owned by the game. What we have to wake up to is that some of us are in relationships that are based on intermittent reinforcement. In this kind of relationship, the things you need, like love, are only granted inconsistently, unpredictably, and occasionally. But the fact that they're granted occasionally keeps you hooked. You're owned by the relationship. You build up so much despair and starvation that when you get a single scrap, the relief you experience by getting that scrap feels like nirvana, and you begin to chase that feeling and do anything you can to get it. If you're in this kind of a relationship, you're either the scientist tormenting the rat, with the potential of pellets, or you're the rat in the cage caught in the cycle of torment. No matter what, if you're in an intermittent reinforcement relationship, you are in an abusive relationship. Abuse is not usually the conscious intent, but it is abuse nonetheless. Intermittent reinforcement can happen with any need or want that we have, and it is especially prevalent in relationships relative to emotional needs. Things like commitment, things like affection, appreciation, closeness, a sense of belonging. Some people fear intimacy. They fear the closeness that comes with relationships. They suffer from insecure attachments, especially people who are avoidant or who experience the avoidant attachment. Now, here's the thing. If you fear intimacy and you have that panic that comes up in relationships in terms of being in them, then most likely the response you're going to have to that type of fear is to try to gain control back over the relationship. So on a conscious level, you're not trying to be abusive, but on the subconscious level, the aspect of you is being abusive, because what it's doing is occasionally giving out what your partner wants so that you can guarantee that they're going to behave in the way you need them to behave. You're intermittently reinforcing your partner. They have no idea that you're doing this. Your partner ends up at your mercy, desperate for the occasional closeness that you grant. Let's give you an example of this. A man spends a wonderful night with a woman, talks to her, connects on a deep level one day, and then the next he doesn't return her phone calls, acts like they're strangers, and pulls away. Then randomly is able to connect again, especially when he senses her pulling away. However, for some people, intermittent reinforcement is much more intentional. This is especially true for people who fall into the category that psychologists would call a personality disorder, things like borderline or narcissist or sociopathy. For these people, control is deliberate. On top of other emotionally abusive tactics like gaslighting, they give or withhold certain needs from their partner, granting them either randomly enough to develop an addiction in their partner, or giving them in response to the exact behavior they want to see in their partner. An example of this is a woman who refuses to make love to her husband unless he cuts off a relationship with his family, or a man who beats his wife or emotionally abuses her, but whom occasionally says I'm sorry and takes her on a wonderful date and buys her what she's been wanting for months. Keep in mind that intermittent reinforcement can be much more insidious and hard to recognize than these rather blatant examples. In these kinds of relationships, the person often begins the relationship giving the other person what they need, giving the pellets, and then inconsistently giving them, and then eventually withdrawing all of the reinforcement. Now, what happens when they withdraw all of the reinforcement is that the person remembers that period of time where they experienced intermittent reinforcement. And because they've become accustomed to periods of time where they were not getting any of the reinforcement, not getting any of the things they need, except for that they learned in the past that it did eventually, occasionally, sometimes come, they remain hooked, regardless of the fact that they are being starved to death. They are hooked on the hope that they will get what they want. They push harder than ever for the closeness that they occasionally got in the past, but may in fact never get again. Intermittent reinforcement creates a starvation within the being. It puts a person who is in charge of the reinforcing in a position of complete and absolute control. You will always see intermittent reinforcement present in an abusive relationship, because it is the most powerful modality of control that you can have over another physical human. These relationships that involve intermittent reinforcement are the very most difficult relationships to walk away from. Why? Because they're not relationships. They're addictions. When a relationship is addictive, your body is addicted to the chemicals that are produced within itself. And getting away from the relationships means that you have to withdraw from those chemicals, just like you would from an actual street drug. So what happens? A person doesn't get out of it. Just like an addict, they stay in the relationship, absolutely obsessively trying to figure out how to create the conditions that enable them to get what they need. In other words, this person will stay in the relationship, deteriorating, desperately trying to figure out the pattern of reinforcement so they can control the conditions of the relationship, so they can get and need what they want from their partner to come out consistently. Mix in the analogies, for example. If I notice that I don't get any pellets when this certain friend of mine is around, then I will get rid of the friend so I can get the pellets from my partner. The person on the receiving end of the intermittent reinforcement may change everything about themselves and lose themselves completely so as to do this. You've all known this person in your life. They get into a relationship, suddenly they stop coming around. It's almost like you're watching them deteriorate before your eyes. They're turning into a shell of a person. They're changing all the things they used to like and love. They're essentially mirroring exactly how their partner wants them to behave. Here's another example of intermittent reinforcement. Take a man with a wife who flies into a rage and makes him sleep in another room for days when he does not do exactly what she wanted him to do. The man has to try anything to gain back her closeness. Eventually, either randomly or if he finds the right thing to do, she may grant him the closeness that he wanted. By doing this, she has trained him to behave in the way that she wants him to behave. He is so relieved by her closeness because his starvation is satiated, he experiences the love for her as much more intense. He thinks he must really, really love her, simply because of the intensity of the relief of being close to her again. Subsequently, he will alter himself completely to avoid the potential punishment again and maintain the closeness he needs from her. He will try to make the relationship as predictable as possible for himself for the sake of his own safety and for the sake of ensuring his own needs will be met. What's on the other side of addiction? Something you are desperate to avoid. This is why addiction is so incredibly difficult to get away from. The minute you let go of whatever it is you're addicted to, you fall into what you were trying to get away from. As it applies to a relationship, this can be things like a feeling of unsafety, a feeling of not belonging, a feeling of isolation, a feeling of emptiness. And those are the kinds of things you have to face when you get out of an addictive relationship. If we put up with intermittent reinforcement in our adult relationships, it is a guarantee that we experienced intermittent reinforcement in our earliest relationships. Think back to mom and dad, especially the most influential adult figures in your childhood. Let's just pretend we lived in a world where law of attraction didn't exist. Let's pretend that you could have consistency in your relationships as a child and line up somehow as an adult with inconsistency in your relationships. You wouldn't put up with it for 3.5 seconds. You would end up getting frustrated with the intermittent reinforcement. You'd be like, screw this, dude. I know what it's like to be on the other side of consistent reinforcement. Peace out. So why do we put up with it? Because based on our earliest relationships, we learn that this is how love should feel. You spend your life lining up with inconsistent partners and trying desperately to do anything you can to make them consistent. Because this is in fact what you needed from your parents. You're trying to solve these old wounds. You're trying to make your inconsistently loving partner into the loving and consistent parent you always wanted. Take a look at the people in your early life. Did any of them meet your needs, especially emotional needs, only inconsistently, unpredictably, and occasionally? I'm going to tip you off to a really, really covert pattern. Often the parent that we feel the closest to and the most affection for, that we always want desperately and love, is the one who in fact practiced intermittent reinforcement with us. So a lot of times if we look back and we have one parent who's the demonized parent, we find that the intermittent reinforcement may have come from them also, but often came from the one that we have such an incredibly strong, intense bond and tie to, the one we want. If you are in an intermittent reinforcement relationship, there is absolutely no middle ground. Consistency is the only answer. It's the only way to actually live a healthy life within the context of this relationship. To live in a healthy relationship, you have to have consistency. You have to have consistency to develop emotional security within a relationship. And so either you develop security, or you remain miserable for the rest of your life, or you cut that person loose. So I'm just going to be really super blunt with you. Either you have a partner who's willing to work towards consistency with you and to create it in the relationship, or you're with a partner who has absolutely no intention of this, and whose intention is in fact to control you completely. They have no intention of changing this pattern because it serves them to stay in control and keep you the rat in the cage with its paw obsessively on the lever so they can ensure that their needs are met. If you are with this kind of partner, you have reason to be afraid. You cannot trust them because they, in fact, intend, either consciously or subconsciously, to betray your best interests for their own aim, which is to control you. This desire to control you also has its roots in trauma, but before you fall into the codependent pattern of thinking you can heal them, it must be known that it is highly unlikely that anyone, least of all you, will be able to do this, because controlling you benefits them. It's how they avoid their own shadows. The only person who can decide to face their own shadows is the person themselves. You're never going to get somebody to do this. And I will tip you off that if you're in the kind of relationship with a person who practices intermittent reinforcement and who has no intention of stopping it because it serves them, they will tell you that they're interested in facing their own shadows, because telling you they're interested in facing their own shadows is, in fact, the intermittent reinforcement. They have no intention of facing their own shadows. It's just that telling you that they're going to is the pellet. It serves to keep you hooked. If you're in this kind of relationship, the time has come to realize that you have been investing in your belief in something you hope will happen, and not in your observation of what has actually happened. Nourishing the hope preserves the status quo, and you are in a relationship with a fantasy. This is not conscious creation. This is in fact a form of denial. Now remember how earlier I said that intermittent reinforcement is a bit more complicated than just involving rewards. It also involves people who don't keep boundaries or rules consistently. This is the role, if you're on the receiving end of an intermittent reinforcement, that you have to play. The reality is that you don't keep your boundaries consistently. Instead, you treat your boundaries like gambling chips. You're willing to give them away in return for something you want. And this may seem benign, but it's in fact your own control tactic. You're trying to gain control over getting what you want by giving something away. In other words, it's a control dynamic on both sides. So you have to get clear about your boundaries. This relationship cannot be transactional and be healthy at the same time. Once you're clear about your boundaries, you have to be very consistent about them. To understand more about boundaries, watch my video titled How to Develop Healthy Boundaries. So to reiterate, if you're in a relationship with somebody who is willing to create consistency in the relationship, who isn't just saying that as a form of intermittent reinforcement, then here is what you have to do. 1, they have to be willing to be consistently granting of your needs within the relationship. They have to respond regardless of the fact that they don't feel like responding. For example, I may not feel like getting close to you, even though I know it's what you need me to do and what the health of the relationship requires of me. I have to do it anyway. On top of that, I have to look at the aspect of me that is causing me to not want to respond in that way. Knowing that I have to get close and that closeness is the key to making this relationship healthy, let's address the aspect of me that is saying, don't get close, pull away. 2, and here is the most important part, because chances are if you're watching this video, you're on the receiving end of the intermittent reinforcement relationship. You need to really be clear about your boundaries and keep them 100%. That means know who you are. Stick to your likes, stick to your dislikes, stick to your values, stick to your interests, and stick to yes versus no. When you say no, it means no. Don't give in. Never make threats in the relationship unless you are 100% willing to follow through with them. Never make promises unless you are 100% willing to keep them. Stop nagging and begging your partner. If they are not giving you what you need, even after you have told them what you need, go get it elsewhere. Decide exactly how much you are willing to put into the relationship before walking away. Be as consistent with your true self as you possibly can, so there is no room for manipulation from the other person. If you're at the point where you are ready and willing to be honest with yourself that you're in fact in a relationship with a person who practices intermittent reinforcement but who has no actual intention of changing, you get to ask yourself whether you want to stay in a relationship where this quite literally is the way it will be for the duration of as long as you are with this person, or whether you are ready to cut your losses and walk away. Now, I want you to beware of something. If you are with a partner who practices intermittent reinforcement, they are immediately going to shift when you walk away. They're going to transform magically into exactly the kind of person you wanted them to be. It is an illusion. This illusion is in fact the pellet. It is yet another form of intermittent relationship reinforcement. And what happens? The minute you get back into the relationship and the minute you commit again, that illusion's going away. They're going to withdraw the pellet and they're going to go right back to doing what they were always doing to begin with. It is extremely difficult to move past this relationship because it is not a relationship, it is an addiction. You will go through withdrawals from the chemicals that your own body produces and fall into the very thing you're trying to avoid by engaging in this relationship. Just like a street drug addict when they choose to quit using. So don't be hard on yourself if it feels like you've lost yourself in the relationship and if it feels like your life falls apart by leaving them. Surround yourself with supportive people who are open to understanding the difficult dynamic of addictive relationships and whom don't unfairly expect you to just get over them, as if you can flip a switch. If you manage to break free from this kind of relationship, it will feel like you have exited an alternate reality. It will feel like you have come out of a fog. It will feel like you have no idea who the hell you are, but as time goes on, you will feel as if you have found yourself again, like you were lost and now you have come back. I can promise you that even though in the beginning it may feel absolutely horrible to get out of this relationship, it will be the best thing you could have possibly done. If you need help with a breakup, watch my video on YouTube titled How to Survive a Breakup and/or Heartbreak. Intermittent reinforcement within a relationship is the most powerful motivator on earth. It is the most powerful way to manipulate another person. It is what keeps you hooked. Intermittent reinforcement is so often the reason why we cannot create any kind of stability and emotional security within our relationships, and why we cannot leave relationships when they are a direct affront to our sense of well-being. So if you notice that you are in this kind of relationship, congratulations, you've made the first step. The first step is we have to become aware that we are in an intermittent reinforcement relationship. The next step is we have to change it. Have a good week.